Good morning again, and welcome in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And for all of you watching this later online, my name is David, and it's my privilege to bring to you a word from the Lord today. Before I go too much farther, I wanted to write something down. This is a last-minute announcement I forgot to. I don't know if I gave Cassie or not, but I wanted to let you all know on July the 11th, so in a couple weeks from now, we're going to be having a church cleaning day. Leap, who was here, the school that was here, they're usually the ones that are helping to clean, and they're not here. They just moved out all their stuff last week. And so July 11th, which is Saturday, just for a couple hours, if you're available to come, we'll be cleaning and vacuuming and washing windows, or if it's not pouring down rain outside, you might do some things outside. But that'll be July 11th, probably from around 9 to 11. So I wanted to give you more than a 1 week's notice, but just wanted to let you know that that's coming up in the life of our church as well. Well, have you ever heard of the phrase, or have you ever used the phrase, "This is taking forever"? You don't have to tell me. I don't need to know about if you feel impatient. Or the phrase, "I've been waiting forever." I know some of you are older than me, but I have it's highly unlikely that we've not been waiting forever. But I've used that phrase a lot, and now that I have children, they use that phrase a lot, I think. And I wrote down some things in my life that it feels like take forever, and maybe they take forever in your mind. There's an old phrase my mom used to use, and I think my grandma used to use, was that it was a watched pot never boils. Anybody heard that before? I've noticed it in my own life. If I'm waiting for something to boil, I'm standing there and I'm watching it, and I'm probably there for like 6 years. It's still not boiling. And eventually, the moment I decide to walk away, and I go to the bathroom or I go check on something, I come back and it's boiling over. It's like the water knows. It knows exactly when I move away, and then it just decides to do something about it. I don't know how it works, but that's how God must have made it. It just takes forever. If you're like me and you go to the grocery store and you always choose the wrong line, somehow you're always waiting. It seems like you're waiting forever, and the line next to you is like empty, and there were 10 people, and somehow you chose the one where people's credit cards go wrong and something happens, and you're just kind of waiting there. And if you're someone that's not like me, the month of February takes forever because you're waiting for spring in Minnesota, and you're saying, when is it going to be spring? It's going to come someday. And if you're like my wife, she says, when is April and May going to come? And then it's still cold sometimes, and then she's waiting for June. Sometimes it takes forever. I've noticed this when I'm on my way somewhere. The red lights, along with the water, they know if I'm in a hurry because the red lights take longer. I'm literally stopping there, and it's the longest red light. Or you're on your way somewhere, and the light's about to turn green, and then someone has an emergency because the police car goes the other direction, it turns green, it resets the whole cycle, and you have to wait again, and then it takes forever. And I think the lights know when we're in a hurry because I always get all the green lights when I don't really care how fast I'm going. And then if you're like my 3-year-old daughter, Brooklyn, anything that takes longer than 30 seconds, she says, "This is taking forever." Or, "Are we done yet?" Or, "Are we there yet?" And I realized that's not really a literal phrase, but we all use the phrase. It feels like sometimes things just take a long time, mostly because our culture is probably impatient, but it seems like it takes longer than we anticipate. One of those times when it felt like things were forever was back in 2019. I don't know where you were in 2019, but I remember where I was. In May of 2019, I was in a hospital, and we were waiting and waiting and waiting for this guy to arrive. And we can put his picture on the screen. This is the guy we were waiting to arrive, waiting, and he couldn't get here. That was about a year later. That's my son Micah, of course, as many of you might know. That's in our old rental house, and we were waiting, and he didn't think, I feel like he was never going to show up. It wasn't just the labor that took a long time, but if you've had children, or if you know people that have children, once you get through the labor part, you think you're almost done, and then you go through the most difficult part, which is the pushing phase. And you're like, okay, now it's time, you're almost there. And then for my wife, it still weren't almost there. I remember it was 7 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, and we had been in the hospital for about 24 hours at that point, and it was time finally. They said, okay, we're finally ready for the last phase. We've been through all the labor and delivery parts, and except for the delivery itself. So we're waiting, and finally, it's the pushing phase. We were ready. I thought, great, it's almost over. That was at 7 o'clock. And then at 9 o'clock in the evening, we hit a crucial moment that I didn't know was crucial. I thought we were almost there. The doctor told Alicia, said, hey, you're doing great. You're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. This is your first child, though, so it takes a little while, and your baby boy's not coming out yet. She didn't seem too concerned, but she gave us a choice. It was in small-town Nebraska, and she said, well, there's another doctor that has more experience than I do with giving children, with delivering, and so we can call her. She literally lives across the street from the hospital. So we can call her and tell her it's not an emergency. And well, eventually we said, yes, let's do that just to be safe. So then around 10 p.m., doctor number 2 arrived, and it didn't take doctor number 2 very long to figure out what doctor number 1 didn't see. What doctor number 1 didn't see was that Micah, instead of coming down face down like you're supposed to, he was face up. And doctor number 2 says if this child continues to be face up, he's not coming out. He can't come out that way. We have to turn him over. Well, 24 hours before that, when they had prepared everything, they had this nice table laid out, and it was laid out for the doctor, a table set before their enemies, and there's a nice sheet on it, and they pulled over the sheet, and they said, okay, all the tools are ready for you now. There was a pushing phase. We'd been there 24 hours, and the doctor said, okay, I need these forceps, these little tools. They look like hot dog grabbers to me. As I need these tools now to be able to help get the baby out. And he looked, and the forceps weren't there. Actually, there were a pair of forceps, but doctor number 2 says, those aren't the ones I like. I need another pair of forceps. Go to the other operation room. Go find them. And it was a small hospital, and they said they weren't there either. They said, we don't know where these things are. And so eventually the doctor had to use her hands and said, okay, I'm going to turn this baby over myself then. And within a few minutes after turning the baby, Micah came out just like that, and he was here and just like that. All in all, Alicia was in labor either at the grocery store or then at home or then at the hospital about 31 hours. And it felt like we were waiting and waiting, and she was pushing. We were waiting and waiting. And I realized afterwards, after everything happens, and I realized the scariest part wasn't that we thought we might be waiting 32 hours or 24 hours. But the scariest part was I realized afterwards that in that place where Micah was, if the second doctor hadn't come and hadn't changed things, we were possibly at a point where you can't have a C-section because they already are the way through, but also you can't do anything about it if you don't wait too long. And we might have literally waited forever for our child. He may not have been able to come unless we would have made the decision to have the second doctor come and to turn Micah over and figure those things out. And in my mind, that really made the term waiting forever put it into perspective, because some things we literally might wait forever for because they're just not coming no matter how long we're waiting for them. Have you ever waited forever before? Either that time where you just think, okay, I'm waiting for you. Are we almost there yet? If you have kids, then you've been there before. If you have nieces and nephews, if you've been there before, they just move a little bit slower. I didn't realize that those 31 hours of waiting on Micah would just lead to a lifetime of waiting on him because he just is not in a hurry most of the time. But sometimes we wait, and eventually we say, finally it happened. And there are other things we wait, and then what we're waiting for never happens. And we say, wait a minute, were we waiting for the wrong thing? Was our waiting worth it? What happens if we get there and there's nothing on the other side? As followers of Jesus in the church, we believe that heaven is our ultimate home. We believe that no matter what we receive or do or don't receive in this life, we at least have our hope of heaven, right? But then as I think about that, there's a long time until we get there. Especially for us, it feels like forever until we make it to where either Jesus returns or we die. There's years or decades in between now and then. So I've often wondered sometimes, what if we're like those people? If you know the book of Hebrews chapter 11, it's the faith chapter, all the people in the Old Testament and part of the New Testament who believed in God, who followed God, and yet they waited and waited. And Hebrews 11:13 says, all these people were still living by faith. When they died, they did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. What happens if we're waiting for something and we die still waiting? Or maybe what if we're waiting for the wrong thing and God says, you've been waiting for that, but I'm actually not going to give you that thing. This week as I studied a scripture that Yusef read for us, I realized it really begged one question. It's a question we ask a lot, but maybe not in this context. It's a question I'll repeat over and over again today because I think it's an important question. It's the question of what are you waiting for? What are we waiting for? Over the last few weeks, we've been in this sermon series entitled Lament, Seeking Joy in the Morning. And so we've been through the book of Lamentations. Again, I've not started doing Lamentations for my devotionals in the morning just because it's mostly a really depressing book. In fact, this chapter and the verses we read are some of the only hope-filled words in the whole book. But we took a break from talking about lament last week, which maybe that's good for some of you. You thought it's not quite as heavy. Last week we watched a video. Alicia and I were gone. But I want to give you a couple of reminders about where we've been, since it's been a couple weeks now, and about what the book of Lamentations is all about, just for a minute or two before we jump right back in and talk through this book once again. So here's a couple things about the book of Lamentations. At this time in history, when this book was written, Israel, God's people, were divided into two sections, northern Israel and southern Israel called Judah. Northern Israel at this time in history had already been destroyed. Another nation came, and because they'd been disobedient to God, God let this nation come and destroy them. They'd been scattered, and they never came back together again. Southern Israel was called Judah, and they had Jerusalem as its capital. And we all know about Jerusalem. We hear about it even today. Well, Lamentations is a book of lament. It's 5 poems or 5 chapters that express grief and sorrow about what was happening during that time. At that time, Jerusalem and the nation of Judah was begun to be taken over by another nation called Babylon. And at that time, the temple where they worshiped God, Jerusalem, their capital city, was destroyed. And that changed everything for them. They didn't know that was even possible. As to, hey, we still have a king God that God was honoring, right? But then they soon realized, after all this destruction, that they had not been honoring God. It wasn't just a random political event, but that God was punishing them and saying, no, you have not been worshiping me. You've not been serving me. You've not been showing the world who I am like I called you to do. Instead, they had been disobedient and unjust to people around them and immoral. And so as this book was being penned, their land was not their own anymore. Their temple was gone, which meant they didn't know where to worship. They didn't know God was even with them anymore because their temple was gone. Many of their people had been deported. Their leaders had been deported somewhere else far away to the city of Babylon. And the future looked bleak. They said, we don't know what to do now. Kind of like you and me at times, they were waiting and waiting for God to answer, and they didn't know if they were waiting for the right things, the wrong things. They didn't know if God would ever answer. They didn't know if they'd be waiting forever. And so as we ask the question, what are you waiting for? What am I waiting for? I think it's also important to ask the question, what were they waiting for as the prophet Jeremiah wrote this book of Lamentations? What were they waiting for? Because we've just read the words, therefore we have hope. What were they hoping for? Well, at the very beginning, just to back up a little bit, the forefathers of Judaism, of the Jewish people, have you ever heard of them, were Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And from the very beginning, the Israelites never really had a hope of heaven. They didn't think about the afterlife too much. They didn't really think, they just thought they're in God's hands. But they thought, well, heaven's a place where God lives, not people. And they didn't really think about it as much as we think about it today. They just thought, okay, everyone ends up in this place called Sheol. They called it the place of the dead. It's this murky, unknown place. We all end up there. They didn't really think about resurrection from the dead as much as we do now. In the time of Jesus, around that time, they began to think about it a little bit, but mostly Jews have always been concerned more about this life than an afterlife. They've been more concerned about being counted as righteous, not as wicked. That's been their main concern. They wanted to please God and serve God in this life. And so at that time when their temple was destroyed and when Jerusalem was destroyed, hope of heaven someday wasn't really on their radar as much, whether they believed in it or not. What they wanted primarily was a military and a political hope, that God would deliver them, that God would take these Babylonians who were not worshiping God, take them out of the picture, give their land back, give their temple back, allow them to serve God once again. Because without those things, they said, we can't worship God. We don't know how to do that without a temple. Kind of like us during COVID. We don't know how to worship God very well without gathering in a place. It was new for us. Their hope was that God would deliver them politically. And therefore, their prophet Jeremiah was calling them to wait on the Lord. Wait for this deliverance. And they said that will give us the ability then to go back to worshiping God and serving Him and being a witness for Him. But the ironic part was, as they're waiting, I'm sure this came to mind, that before they had been destroyed, before they had been taken over by this foreign nation, they had all that. They had the land, they had the political freedom, And because of all that, even though they had that, they weren't actually worshiping God. It wasn't like an automatic thing. As long as they have this land, as long as they have this temple, they automatically worship God. That was the intent. But that hadn't been happening. That guy I mentioned a while back, or a few minutes ago, Abraham, he used to be called Abram. And when God first called the people, when he first built this nation to reflect God's holiness, to show the world who he was, he called Abram and told Abram, you are going to have kids, and your kids and grandkids and descendants will bless the whole world, and they're going to show the world who I am, because the world doesn't understand who I am. And it took time, and eventually God fulfilled his promise to Abraham, as many of you know. Abraham eventually had a son and a grandson, and he had 12 great-grandsons. And each of those 12 great-grandsons were the head of a tribe that were eventually known as the 12 tribes of Israel. As God continued to fulfill those promises to Abraham and his people, eventually, God told each of these tribes, you're each going to have a piece of the land that I promised to your great-grandfather, Abraham. God had said, all this land I'm going to give you. And so Abraham had 12 great-grandsons, and each one of those great-grandsons of these tribes had a portion. You get this portion of the land. This is what I'm going to give you. This is your portion. And that was God's way of blessing them and saying, I'm providing for you. Every tribe had a portion except for one of them. And that was the tribe of Levi. They didn't receive any land. They didn't get land like everybody else. They were the priests. They performed the temple rituals like sacrifices to get forgiveness. They didn't get their own land. Instead, this is what God said to Aaron, the leader of the Levites. He said this in Numbers chapter 18. He said, and the Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no inheritance in their land, neither shall you have any portion among them, for I am your portion. I am your portion. And those words will sound familiar, more familiar in just a minute. I am your portion and your inheritance among the people of Israel. I remember reading these words a while back in seminary when I was training, and I'm a dad, kind of like Jesus tells us we can call God Father. And when I read this, I think that sounds like a father who kind of messed up a little bit. That's what it sounds like to me. Because when I'm thinking to myself, okay, God had this land he's going to give to the people of Israel, right? And each one gets a portion. It sounds like if it were me as a dad, I'd say, man, Abraham, you had 12 great-grandsons. I only have enough land for 11 of you. And so what am I going to do? Say, well, the 12th one, I'll just say, well, yeah, I don't have enough land for you, but I'll make you my special possession instead. It's like if I don't have enough candy for both my kids, I'll say, well, you get some candy. Hey, I'm going to give you a high five. Is that okay? Like, you don't get candy, but I'll try to make it better. That's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like I ran out of land, but at least I'll give you something. You get to be my treasured possession. That's how it's going to work. That's not what God was doing, but that's what it sounds like to me. He ran out of land. What am I going to do? I'll just make something up to make sure I have enough. As I've told you before, God's a better father than I am. That's not what God was doing, even though that's what it sounds like. What did God mean when he said, I am your portion? Because that's what we read in the book of Lamentations as well. Lord, you are my portion. You are our portion, therefore I will wait for you. The psalmist in chapter 16 says, Lord, you alone are my portion. What does that mean, to have a portion? At that time, it was very, very important for a father to give kids inheritance, or also known as a portion. And usually that was something of concrete value. It wasn't like I'll give you my love or I'll give you something abstract. It was something like a valuable possession or a monetary resource. But the best thing they could give was a piece of land, because land was everything. Now for me, if my parents were going to give me something, they could give me land, but that's great. I don't know how to do anything. I'm not a farmer. I mean, I could have land, but I would either rent it out or I'd sell it. Because for us in the 21st century, land can mean something, but many times money means something else to us. That means more to us, having money, having possessions. Because money helps us to provide for our families, to have shelter. It helps us to have a sense of security. It provides for us in those ways. We can't have a living, we can't make a living without money today. But for the generations before us, even all those back in the time of Lamentations, they needed land. Land was how they grew food. Land was how they knew they had the ability to take care of their family, to build a shelter, their way of surviving and thriving. And so for 11 of the 12 tribes, land was their portion. That's how God said, hey, this is how I'm providing for you. It gave them security and food, and some of them fortune. But the tribe of Levi was different, and God was being very specific with them. God was trying to communicate something unique, not just to them, but to all people. To the Israelites, God was saying, I am your portion. What normally you'd look for in other things such as land or resources, he said, that's what I am to you, Levites. I want to be your status and your security and your provision and everything you need to survive, because without me, you literally will have nothing left. You see, they had land, but God was trying to communicate to them was land can't give you everything I can. I am here for you in a way that land can't be there for you. In these moments in Lamentations, they realized land couldn't provide everything. Land could be taken away. Land wouldn't save them from their enemies. Land couldn't keep promises and deliver them and fulfill them. And so in the book of Lamentations, they were crying out to God and saying, we have no land, we have nothing left, our portion is gone. What do we have left, Lord? And they cried out to God, finally. If we fast forward in the story a little bit, we find eventually God answered them. As they repented, God delivered them from Babylon. It took 70 years, but eventually God delivered them. They gained back their political deliverance and their political freedom. They had their land back. And the book of Nehemiah talks about how they rebuilt their city walls, and God had given them exactly what they had asked for. And we find out then that they began to obey God, right? And they learned from their mistakes, and they finally were enabled. Then now we have the land. And eventually they build a second temple. Now we can worship God now. Now we can go back to being God's people. And they never rebelled again, right? Wrong. See, the land, the political deliverance, and the temple were blessings from God, and the purpose of them was to lead them to God, to realize that God was the one providing for them. But in the end, the land and the temple became their portion, became what God was supposed to be. And when they had their portion, when they had their land, they didn't think they needed anything else, and that's when they turned away from God, because they had everything they needed. If you fast forward again to the New Testament, when Jesus arrives, we find the story repeats itself again and again. Because when Jesus arrived on the scene, he was literally everything that they needed. He was God in human flesh. He showed them how to be human, how they were supposed to live. But Jesus didn't do what God did in the Old Testament. Jesus didn't give them back their political freedom. Romans had eventually destroyed their second temple that they built. Rome had been oppressing them. They didn't have their own political freedom or their own land that was their own, and Jesus didn't give it back to them. Jesus didn't give them what they wanted, and so they rejected Jesus, and they said, we'll just wait for our Messiah. This can't be him. He's not giving us our portion. And the Jews who reject Jesus as the Messiah are still the ones today who are still waiting. And they're waiting for their Messiah who will give them their portion of what they think they want, of what they think they need. And yet they'll literally be waiting forever because their Messiah came and they didn't want him. They wanted the portion they thought they should get back. And what we read today from Lamentations 3:24, the prophet Jeremiah is believed to be the one writing this, and he says, I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. See, Jeremiah knew something and believed something that the rest of the Jews often didn't believe, that the Lord was their portion, even more than the land, more than the resources, more than anything else. God was their portion. Israel and Judah, they were waiting for political deliverance. They're waiting and waiting. The Jews are still waiting. The question we're asking today is not just what were they waiting for, but what are you waiting for and what am I waiting for? In the end, the Jews didn't really want God to be their portion because God came and was there literally with them and they didn't recognize him. They relied on their land and their physical building. When they didn't have that, they thought they had nothing left, like God had abandoned them. So what are we waiting for? What is our hope? I think the scariest question we have to ask is the question I asked myself after Micah was born, is that what if I would have been waiting forever? Or the question that the Jews maybe are, what if we, like the Jews, will be waiting forever for something that's not coming? I think sometimes as I'm waiting and praying, I ask myself, Lord, am I waiting on the right things? Am I waiting for you? Or am I waiting for what I think you're going to give me that may never be coming, and I may literally be waiting forever? And like the Jews, am I going to miss when you show up because I'm waiting for the wrong thing? See, for some of us, our hope is unlike the Jews at that time. Our hope is to get through this life and just make it to heaven, just to survive until then, and then we can escape and be fine and be with God, and that will fix our problems. But in the meantime, we deal with a broken world, and we don't know what to do with that. And so, it sounds pretty grim for the next few years or decades until we get there. For others of us, we're waiting on other things. If you're like me and you've been part of LifeBridge for a while, we're waiting for God to bless us. We're waiting and waiting for these jars over here we've been talking about for a while. This one called New Disciples. Micah, my son, knows that he's the only rock in here. He's the one that came to Jesus. We're waiting and waiting and saying, God, when will, as we continue to pray and pray for people who don't know Jesus, when is this other jar going to fill up with people who need Jesus? When's this jar going to be filled with new disciples that we're making as we pray and seek? We want the sanctuary to be full on Sunday mornings as it once was a long time ago. We want to be a blessing to our community, to love people who are unconnected, who are unsupported, without family, who are lonely. We want to build relationships with people who don't know Jesus. We want to be a church that's not only growing, but then eventually plants other churches in our community and is a blessing to those around us. And of course, in the process, we think if we have those things, God, then we can get to know you, we'll be worshiping you, and then we'll be making disciples. That's what we'll be doing, what you've called us to do. And yet I've seen and I've realized that I've been a part of lots of local churches that they're actually doing those things. And is it possible, if God ever gets us there, to do those things and yet not know God? Could we miss the possibility of knowing God well while we're receiving those blessings? Because it seems like in our culture we think, okay, if God's blessing us with all these things, that means we're pleasing God, we know God. Is it possible to have those things and still miss it and want the things without Him, even if they're all good things? Perhaps your hope in Jesus is that you won't have to live paycheck to paycheck anymore, that you'll be out of debt. Maybe your hope is that you have grandkids or kids or nieces or nephews or friends who will someday love Jesus. Maybe your hope is that you'll have kids or grandkids or a spouse or a house someday. And of course, in hoping for that, maybe that will then help us to enable us to worship God more, to serve Him, to know Him better, because those are stepping stones and parts of the journey and checkpoints. But what if God comes and shows up without those things? Will we still recognize Him? Will He be enough for us? See, in answering the question, what are we waiting for, we have to ask the question, who or what is our portion? Who are we relying on? Something else might be a good thing, like political freedom or land or a blessing or being out of debt or kids or grandkids or bright futures or a clean bill of health, and all those are good things. But are we okay with the fact if we wait and they never happen, will God be enough for us still? Because we could literally be waiting forever. The Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for Him. Like many of the sermons in this series so far in the book of Lamentations, it's not a happy-go-lucky, great, let's go have a potluck together and eat some food afterwards and praise Jesus. And so you might say, okay, David, how do I respond to this? What do I do? Is there a challenge with this? Or am I just depressed because I'm not sure what to do with this? Well, the first thing I always ask you to do is to pray and reflect. We'll have some time to reflect and say, Lord, what are you saying to me? But for me specifically, I realize what I see in my own life, my prayer life, that possibly needs to change at time, and maybe it does for you. For me, I realize that when I'm praying with my kids or praying for myself, I pray a lot for well-being and relief from pain because I'm a wimp when it comes to pain. I pray for safe travels. I pray for my kids to have a good day without bullies. I pray for broken bones and aching backs and unfortunate circumstances to be resolved. I pray for others who are in pain, that God will relieve them of that pain, because again, I told you I don't like pain. Then I realized, what if God was calling me for a week or two to pray a little bit differently? Because sometimes God uses those things rather than taking away the storm. He says, no, the storm is really important and you can't see it right now. I want you to stay in this storm because that's how you're going to know me better. And he said, what if, David, you started praying that primarily that God would make himself known to you, like the song we've been singing now for several weeks, the Holy Spirit song we began with. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness. For us to rely on God and say, maybe my prayer needs to be, Lord, will you make it so that you are my portion? And reveal to me when you are not my portion, when I rely on something else instead. The hope is that if we're waiting for God and not for other things, then we won't be waiting forever, even though it seems like it. And so as we prepare to close today, we're not going to have a roundtable discussion like we normally do, because we'll have some of that at our potluck as we eat together behind this wall in the fellowship hall in a few minutes. But I do want to take some time just to be quiet before the Lord, to pray, to reflect. In just a minute, we'll have some questions on the screen, and they're kind of prayers you can ask or things you can consider. If you do have a question or you say, hey, I need someone to pray for me at your table, you're welcome to do that. If you want to come up to the altar and pray, you're welcome to do that as well. But let's take some time to pray and just ask God what he's saying to us today. So here's some questions to consider. First, what do you pray for more than anything else? What's one thing that keeps coming back to your mind? I keep praying for this and praying for that. Is it possible that God's asking you to change that prayer at all? Maybe not. Maybe God says, no, you continue to pray and be faithful in praying for this or for this person in this way. But is it possible that God's asking you to change your prayer like he's asking me to change mine? Thirdly, you could pray and ask God, Lord, are you my portion? Or am I relying on something else or someone else more than you? And third, you could say, Lord, what else are you trying to say to me today? Something else I need to hear? For the next few minutes, probably 3 or 4 minutes, we'll just take some time to be quiet before the Lord. If you want to write down these questions, you can pray them later on this week. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, we're going to close in a different way today. There'll be a music video that plays, just playing a song that reminds us of our need for God, that it's not about us and we can't save ourselves, but it's about trusting in him. So it takes a few minutes to pray. We'll watch a video and then we'll close with our benediction in just a little bit.